Hi, I'm David Fuselier. I'm a product designer who works on design systems. In a design system, you usually support multiple devices and environments. So, a design system usually supports phones, probably tablets, probably desktops, maybe even TVs. And even some of them support things like print media, maybe an invoice on a letter-sized sheet of paper. And if you worked on a design system like that, you know that creating a unified typographic system that wrangles all that into something manageable is not really a walk in the park. So I'm going to show you a tool I created called Type Director that'll help you wrangle all that complexity into something that is easy to create, easy to maintain, and isn't going to make you pull your hair out. So typography systems are usually based on something called a modular scale. And what a modular scale is a set of font sizes that are related by a common ratio, so they're all proportional. Typographers have been doing this for a long, long time. You can see evidence of this of modular scales in things like the Gutenberg Bible made hundreds of years ago. So there are a few tools out that help you actually calculate modular scales pretty easily. This is one example called modularscale.com. And if you don't know, usually you create a modular scale by specifying a base size or base font size, and then defining some kind of ratio that create all your subsequent font sizes. So you can see here that I have a base of 16 and the ratio is 2.0. So you can see that starting from 16, the next size up is 32. 16 times 2 equals 32. And the size above that is 64. 32 times 2 equals 64. And so it's pretty easy to create a modular scale, and tools like this make it even easier. Usually people create a modular scale based on a ratio that they find appealing. So, for example, the golden section is a ratio that is supposedly found in everywhere in nature, everywhere from plants to seashells, things like that. So you can create modular scales by picking out a ratio that feels meaningful to you. And I think this technique was a really good way for typographers to show intent when they were creating typographic systems that were static. So ones that maybe you were creating a typographic system for a poster or a book. And you really never needed to consider how your typographic system would adapt to other types of things, right? If something was in a book, it was never really not going to be elsewhere. It was always going to be in that book. So one criticism I have of defining modular scales like this is that it's, to me, kind of fundamentally rooted in the past when all media was pretty much static. I think we need new tools for today that help you create responsive typographic systems. And when you create a responsive typographic system, generally that means you're not going to have one ratio that stays static for all time. You're going to have other ratios that you use for depending on what device you're actually working on at that given moment. So I think tools like this are a little too slavish maybe to the past, and that we can create a better typographic system for responsive design systems by thinking carefully about what the constraints and inputs into a modular scale should be. All right, so without further ado, let's create a responsive typographic system with Type Director. So this is Type Director, and what I want you to notice here is that here on the left, what we can do is edit a number of variables that are basically going to define the constraints of your typographic system. And from those constraints, compute all the different sizes and line heights that you need. Over here on the right, you can see the output. So what is the result of all the constraints that you define on the left-hand side? So the first of those constraints is number of sizes. So it should be pretty self-explanatory what that does. It's the number of sizes in your typographic system. So every typographic system has a base size. Your base size is always 0, and it's the size that most of the content in your app is going to be set in. In addition to the base size, you can define an arbitrary number of larger sizes. So here I have 4 larger sizes, and so if you scroll up, you see it goes from 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 sizes larger than my base size. Smaller size does exactly what you would think it would do. So I have one smaller size specified, so I have one size smaller than my base size. Maybe that's something that's good for footnotes or small captions or something like that. So generally, I do one smaller size and 4 larger sizes. And the reason is that including the base size, that's about 6 sizes. So if you're that supports H1 through H6 tags on the web, right? So supporting 6 different sizes is usually the least number you need to do. But of course, that's up to you and your use cases and your opinions and all that. But this is generally how I do it. Okay, so the next thing we're going to define are our scales. So like I said, it's not a good idea to use a single scale for all the different types of devices you support because all those different devices are used in a different way. So what we're going to do is we're going to define a scale for each of our devices one at a time. And first off, we're going to start with a phone size device. So let's start with this first scale right here. We're going to call it phone because it's for a phone. And to kind of get a good idea of what I'm doing and how it applies to a phone, I'm going to resize my screen so the copy here is about as wide as you would see it on a phone. Of course, you really want to do this on an actual phone so you can get a real sense of whether all the things you're doing are appropriate or not. But for the sake of this video, bear with me. So the first thing I'm going to do for my phone scale is I'm going to choose a base size. So my base size should be something that's really, really comfortable to read on. It should not be so small that I have to hold my phone inches from my face, right? Because no one likes that, or I have to squint. It should be a size that is comfortable to read with on a phone. Of course, the right size for you is going to depend on your use case. Maybe if you're working on let's say an app that has a lot of complexity, maybe a comfortable reading size is something like 16 pixels, right? So because it has a lot of complexity, we can't make it too big because then we wouldn't be able to fit the types of things we need to fit on the page. So maybe 16 is a good size for that use case, but let's say if we were working on an app that was about reading, let's say maybe it was an ebook reader or a blog post, something like that. Maybe you'd want to make your base size a little bit larger. Maybe 20 or 18 would be something that's more appropriate. But let's just say for now, we'll go with 16. And of course, you can determine what units you use down here. We're going to stick with pixels just for the sake of simplicity right now. All right, so we have a base size. Now, the next thing we're going to do is set a max size. So while a base size, I like to choose it based on what makes for comfortable reading. A max size, I like to basically push it as far as I possibly can without making it impractical, okay? So if this is about the size of a phone and I make my max size 120, you can see that this is so big that it's not really practical. I can probably not fit anything that's larger than a 5-letter word at this size, right? So what you want to do is basically find the size that is both practical and big enough that it creates a lot of contrast between all the interstitial sizes, right? So you can see this one, I have a lot of contrast, but it's not practical. So I'm going to bump this down to, let's say, 48. So this looks a little more practical. I can fit a good bit of content, but maybe I'm not too happy with the contrast, right? Maybe as I scroll down from 4 to 3 to size 2, maybe I'm hoping that I can get a little more impact by increasing the contrast between all my sizes, right? So let's say for the sake of argument, I bump it up to 52. And let's say that maybe that's a good balance between a good line length and what I can fit on a single line, and also having some good contrast between each of my sizes all the way down to 0. So by defining the base size and the max size and thinking deeply about what makes a good base size and what makes a good max size, I've had all the interstitial sizes kind of computed for me. So that's really handy and convenient. So that's setting your base and max font size for your phone. All right? So the next thing I want to do is I want to look at my line heights. So I have a base line height right now of 1.45, and you can see at my base size, 1.45 is looking pretty good. That's a texture that I think looks pretty nice. It's easy to read, it's aesthetically appealing. I don't feel like there's too much drift happening between the text, and so it's an efficient use of space. But if you notice something, I think this is something a lot of typographic systems and digital products don't do very well, is if I have a constant line height, both in my base and my max size, you see that as I go up and as my sizes get larger, there starts to be a little bit of drift and the text starts to look kind of awkward, right? You can see that in this size number 4, this text is spaced way too far apart. It looks kind of weird. And so I think, for example, like Bootstrap used to use 1.4 for all of their sizes, right? And that doesn't really jive with larger sizes, so I think we can do a little bit better. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at my max size and try and take it down to something that looks pretty good. And so let's say we take it down to 1.2, and that looks a little bit more reasonable, right? It's a good use of space. And I think it's pretty good because if I scroll all the way down, I can see that I have a kind of even texture all the way down from the top, my largest size, all the way down to my base size. So what's cool about this is instead of having to set a line height for each and every size by hand, TypeDirector interpolates between the max and the base line height to create that nice even texture and that gradual decreasing the line height as you get larger and larger. Right? So that was super easy and it looks great. So let's say we're pretty happy with our phone size. All right, so next I'm going to add a little bit of responsive behavior to our typographic system by adding a modular scale for desktop. So I'm going to click down here and click Add Scale, and I'm going to call this one Desktop. And I'm going to resize my screen so it kind of approximates the real estate you would have on desktop. All right, so what you should notice at the top, now that I've added a scale, I can go ahead and switch to my desktop scale. And let's, as a starting point, make this match what we did for phone. So 16 for base, 52 for max, 1.45 for the baseline height, and 1.2 for the max line height. So this is the same as my phone scale right now. But like on the phone scale, I'm going to start by thinking about what makes a good base size. So if you think about how you hold a phone, it's generally a little bit closer to your face than this your desktop screen, right? When I'm using a laptop or a desktop, my computer's on a desk. I'm sitting back in my chair. Hopefully I'm sitting back comfortably and not hunched over with my face close to the screen, squinting, trying to read a bunch of small text, right? So because desktop and laptop screens are generally further from your face than phone screens, you need to compensate for that because things that are farther away appear smaller. So to compensate for that, we're not going to use the same base size we did for phone. We need to bump that up to something larger. So let's say I bump it up to 20 pixels, right? And let's say I think that looks a little bit better. I'm no longer hunched over trying to read tiny 16 pixel text. I feel like I'm sitting comfortably in my seat, able to read. So let's say we like that base size. And let's go then again to the max size and think about what makes for a good max size. So whenever you do anything in design, of course, contrast is king. So having a lot of contrast is going to make your designs feel more impactful. And so we still have it as 52, but given that we bumped our base size up, we're not seeing a whole lot of contrast. In addition to that, on desktop, we have a lot more real estate to take advantage of. So let's try and bump that up, and let's bump it up to something like 72. And you can see that here, size 4, it's looking really impactful. We're taking advantage of all that real estate. We're getting to fit a lot of words on a line. So 72 is much larger and looking pretty good on desktop. So getting a lot more contrast and impact when we have that available real estate. So we got our font size taken care of. It's adjusted and we're pretty happy with it. So what we want to do is go back and check our line heights, right? So we did increase the font size here. But I think the line height still looks pretty good, right? Even though we increased it, you might think we need to decrease the base size, but because the line length is longer, you still need a little extra line height just so you don't lose track of what line you're on as your eye kind of moves line to line. So let's say that we still kind of like the line height of 1.45 for this. But if you scroll up again, now that we have a much bigger font size, maybe we want to take that max line height down a bit just to make sure we don't have that much drift, right? So let's go down to 1.1. Maybe, let's say we think that looks good. All right, so now we have a phone and desktop size, and you can see how it adapts between environments. Pretty cool, right? So you can do this for an unlimited number of environments. If you wanted to create a TV scale, because you had a TV app, you could do that. If you wanted to create a print scale for, let's say, you produce some PDF invoices that are based on a letter size papers, something like that, you can create a print scale. You could create a tablet scale. You can create scales for any number of environments based on as many use cases as you have. So Type Director helps you manage all that complexity by just getting you to define a base and max size for each environment and then handling everything else. I hope you can see how it's kind of a different take from traditional modular scales, right? Those traditional modular scales focus on finding a ratio that's kind of sounded pretty. Type Director is different because it instead focuses on finding the ratio that works for each environment based on the unique constraints of that environment. That's a really different way of thinking about how to create modular scales. Okay, so I'm going to show you one more really cool thing that we can do with Type Director. So you probably know, if you work a lot on digital products, that most digital products tend to use one typeface. And the reason for that is not because using one typeface is inherently better, right? Throughout the history of graphic design and typography, a lot of brands have made really, really beautiful use of combining multiple typefaces into really, really attractive layouts and products and things like that. The reason I think that most digital products only use one typeface is just because it's really, really hard to manage multiple typefaces, right? There are a lot of things that typographers, when they're manually setting type, do to help multiple typefaces be more harmonious, and it's just really not, it hasn't been practical to do that inside of a design system. So I'm going to show you how Type Director can help you kind of recapture some of that multi-typeface magic. So for the final input, I'm going to scroll down to a typefaces section. So you probably noticed by now that we've been working with Georgia as our kind of body typeface. So we have it right here. You can see that we're calling it our body typeface. You can see that the font family is Georgia, and that's what's causing this to display in Georgia. What I want to show you is that with Type Director, you can add multiple typefaces. So let's go ahead and do that. So let's say that I have a special typeface I want to use for my headings in my site. And let's say that is Verdana. And let's say that I'm going to go ahead and make this bold just so I can kind of see a little bit of how those two are going to interplay in my site. So let's say this is going to be my heading typeface, this is going to be my body typeface. Now, one of the things that typographers would do when they were manually setting type in posters and things like that is when they combine multiple typefaces, if you're trying to align something to a modular scale, it's kind of annoying to have two typefaces with different X heights. So the X height is the height of the lowercase letters, and that's what controls how big your typeface looks, right? So mathematically, Georgia at size 4 is set to 72, just like Verdana, but if you look at it visually, Verdana appears a little bit larger. So that can kind of throw off your modular scale, right? If you have one typeface that at the same mathematical size looks visually different. So one of the things that Type Director can help you do at scale is normalize multiple typefaces to one another. So if Georgia is your default, and that's the thing you base your modular scale on, what you can do is you can scroll down to Verdana and you can make minute adjustments to font size, line height, and things like that that will apply only to Verdana. So what I can do is I can kind of start bumping Verdana down until I think my X height looks about even. So I think Verdana looks optically a little bit bigger still. So I'm going to bump it down to 0.88. So what that means is for size 4, Verdana will appear about 12% smaller than Georgia. So these are no longer mathematically equal, but they are optically equal, right? And that's really what you want, so you can feel like no matter what typeface you're using, it's always aligning to your modular scale. So Type Director is helping you do that. You can see that it's automatically decreasing Verdana for every size, but it's also recalculating the line height so that your baselines stay aligned, right? So you have to, because the way line heights work, you multiply the font size by the line height to get the effective line height. So if you're decreasing the font size here, you need to have a new line height too that still makes sure that all your type is kind of lining up appropriately. So that's really, really powerful stuff with Type Director. I think it will make you crazy trying to imagine how painful it would be to do all of this by hand. But by using some smart math, we can kind of manage that complexity, and no one really has to think about it. They just have to pull one lever, this little font size variable for that, right? So that's really, really cool stuff, I think. And you know, like maybe one font size or two font sizes is pretty cool, but look how easy it is to just go ahead and add more and more font sizes. So let's say you're maintaining documentation for your design system, right? And you probably need a monospaced typeface, like one they use in code snippets or things like that. So we can do the same thing for Monaco. So let's add Monaco to this. Let's do the same thing and normalize it to the rest of our stuff. And let's say I'm going to put that one down to 85. Let me check and make sure. Sometimes I like to check my smaller sizes to make sure it looks even there too. So yeah, so we've just normalized Monaco, so you can show little code snippets and running text and not have Monaco's X height be totally different than Georgia's or Verdana's, right? More cool stuff. And it gets even cooler for there. What if we use a bunch of icons? We don't want our icons, we want our icons to kind of pair up with our type really well, right? If you put an icon in front of some text and a button, you don't want the icon to look huge and the text to look small. So let's say we add an icon font. Let's say we use wingdings for some reason, right? Oop. And so now we have wingdings added to our typographic system. So let's do the same thing. Let's normalize wingdings so it kind of looks like it pairs better in terms of the icon size with the text. So let's do it to about, yeah, let's do 0.8, right? So let's decrease this. Oh no, look, that looks a little tiny over there. Let's make it a little bigger. Let's see. Yeah, sometimes it's easier to tell when you go down to these smaller sizes. Yeah, so I think that's looking pretty good. And so now we have 4 different typefaces whose X heights are normalized so they all align to our modular scale, right? Again, think about how much math that would be to calculate on your own. And think about how if you tweaked any one variable in the system, you'd have to manually recalculate everything else. So I think this is showing how powerful Type Director is and how you can use it to create really, really complicated, nuanced typographic systems that do things that typographers traditionally do, that add a lot of nicety to the typography you have in your site, but managing it through some really smart math so it doesn't make you want to pull your hair out, right? All right, so I think we've done a pretty good job creating our typographic system. So let's say we're a designer, we finished up, and now we're ready to hand this off to development, right? So handing off to development is super simple because Type Director is able to basically export design tokens using an NPM module called Theo. So whenever you're done, you can press this download tokens button, and what you're going to get is a zip file of your typographic system in a number of different formats. So if you open it up, you'll notice that in this typography folder we have 3 files. One is in a JSON format, which your iOS developers can use. One is in a SAS format that your web developers can use, and one is in an XML format that your Android developers can use. So Type Director makes it really easy to distribute your type system to any platform that you might support. One other thing I'll call out is that if you need a little bit more control, if you're a developer, you want to use Type Director and you want to actually export it as actual design tokens and then control how they're translated into web or Android or iOS, you can go here to GitHub where I have Type Director as an NPM module. So you can download it. You can basically tweak all the same settings. So you can see here that all the same controls that were in the web interface are also here. You can integrate this with your project and on the fly, make changes to this, see how it changes your product, and easily work together with Theo to create design tokens and export them to any other platform or anything like that. So that's it. I hope you see the value in Type Director, and I hope you consider using it for your project. And if you do, please let me know how that goes. Thanks.